Good morning. Good to be with you all this morning as we begin a new sermon series, Be Real. We've had a really wonderful time this fall over the past couple of weeks, really getting into these brighter moments in our lives, brighter days, brighter weeks, brighter breaths. Now we're leaning into a time of authenticity. Leaning into those ways in which we want to be connected as people, as a community of faith. And we're starting, of course, with one of those words that you want to come to church to hear, and that's, we're all sinners, right? Just as good of a place to start as any. And so, as part of this Be Real series, we are going to be asking some people in our congregation to share little bits, little words, little responses to some questions to get us into this Be Real series and to have moments of authenticity together. So the question that we asked this week, and if you're here on Wednesday night and you see one of us with a camera, you might want to run the other direction. No, I'm just... The question that we asked this week was, what's your guilty pleasure? As a kind of humorous way to get us into our sermon this morning. And I'll hand it over to Gordon and Mike.
Do you know what a guilty pleasure is?
I think it's like something that you don't get to do that much, but you love to do it.
Yeah, I think that's about right. Do you know anybody who you know well who has a silly guilty pleasure?
My mom, she loves doing donuts, having donuts always, but she never gets to do it because of my dad.
Does your dad have any guilty pleasures?
My dad has a guilty pleasure, but he never gets to do it because mom's always home. He likes to shop for Legos.
That's pretty good. Thanks, Gordon. What's one of your guilty pleasures?
Well, I think we tend to always think we should be doing stuff for others, and there's one thing I do just for myself, and I'm the only person that benefits, and that's when I go on motorcycle trips. And quite honestly, when I'm riding along, just living in my own world, I feel guilty about not being with my family and leaving them behind. But I'm going to keep on riding as long as this old body allows me to hold the bike up.
So a huge thank you to Gordon and, of course, Gordon's parents, more importantly, and Mike, thanks for sharing some of your responses. It certainly wouldn't be fair if I just let them do the talking of guilty pleasures and didn't do my own confession in front of all of you fine sinners this morning too. Yesterday my spouse and I were in the car and she listed off 8 or 10 and I was like, well, I don't have that much time, Hannah. So we picked one together and she snapped a photo right away. If you are in marketing at Target, I know there are some of us in this church who are, I am your mark because every time at Target I cannot say no to this thing right at the checkout aisle. Anybody else? Like, it's just there, just smiling at me. It's delicious, and I'm usually in between meals, and it's got protein, right? I mean, it's got peanuts in it, you know. So, anyway, there's my guilty pleasure, and I think for many of us, this is a kind of an easy way into the pool as we talk about sinners and saints. A lot of us have all sorts of baggage when we talk about sin, right? Maybe we've been in church communities where sins have been held as a spotlight. Maybe we've been in church communities where sins have been held up against you and prevented you from participating in the broader life of the church. We are a community that's going to wrestle with this in some new ways together. We're going to try to work through some of those places that we've been taught in the past and learn together what God might be speaking into us in this idea of us as sinners and saints. If you'll allow me, I think we'll be able to be real together a little bit this morning. And the first thing that I want to say, and I think this gets right at the heart of these couple of videos, is that when we think of guilty pleasures, when we think of things that are just delicious and good just for us, I think somehow in some of our minds we've come to understand that maybe pleasure is sinful. The things that I really enjoy are somehow wrapped up in sin. And I'm here to say that pleasure isn't a sin. We're going to repeat that creed across the hallway in the fellowship hall in a few minutes. There are plenty of donuts to be had. This is not a sin, right? Buying Legos and enjoying playing with Legos, not a sin, of course. Going out on that motorcycle ride, enjoying the wind through your hair or helmet or however that works, clearly not a motorcyclist. But enjoying being on the road, not a sin. Pleasure isn't a sin. Pleasure isn't a sin, but some of us have gotten into our bones this understanding that taking care of ourselves, that spending a moment in time to fill up our cup is somehow something that we shouldn't do all that often. That maybe once in a while it's okay if we get permission, but to actually just enjoy and celebrate the life that we're in is somehow wrapped up in this sinfulness. Anybody else have some of these quandaries? I mean, we can be honest together, right? And I think they're on a spectrum, you know? I mean, some of us, I don't really have that hang up, you know? Until we see that brownie and maybe we say something like, oh, that looks sinful, right? Right? I mean, we have this in our language. And I think this comes, at least from my understanding, from a really fabulous preacher who preached in the 1700s. His name was Jonathan Edwards, and I've come to you with an excerpt from one of the most famous sermons in the English language, also preached here in the United States. Maybe you've heard it before. It's called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Ooh, spicy. Let's read. O sinner, consider the fearful danger you are in. It is a great furnace of wrath, a wide and bottomless pit full of the fire of wrath that you are held over in the hand of the God whose wrath is provoked and incensed as much against you as against many of the damned in hell. Whew. Come back to church next week and we'll have, right? And I know this is a caricature. We're not going to church in 1741 anymore, but I think some of us have some of this sense in us. Maybe we've picked it up, at least in the church that I grew up with, a preacher who slammed his fists on the pulpit, who got pretty angry about stuff, who stirred up the spirit. They're usually not Lutheran preachers if you grew up Lutheran, but occasionally, right? We've got kind of into this in the culture of this way that sin is somehow always prowling. And so I thought it would be helpful as we're talking about sinner and saint, and particularly our Lutheran understanding of being sinners and saints, to really lean in together to ask the question, what is a sin? And what is a sinner? Well, the second one's easy. A sinner is you. It's also me. We're all sinners, right? That's the easy one. But what's a sin, all right? So I present to you three things. Sin is one, an action. This is the easiest one, right? We know this one. But sin is also two, a condition. All right, we'll get into that in a minute. And then finally, number three, sin is a web, okay? Now, we hear these words about sin in the very first moments of the Bible in the book of Genesis. It's the very first book of the Bible, and you probably know this character from that book, right? Anyone afraid of snakes? I know, it's kind of a little bit dangerous showing a big old snake on the screen. We know the story of the Garden of Eden, right? We have Adam and Eve, and all of a sudden, and they're living this life of perfection, this life of celebrating all of God's goodness. If they had motorcycles, I'm sure Adam and Eve would have been just riding along, eating donuts, building Legos. You know, they were just enjoying God's goodness in the garden. And then all of a sudden, this wily serpent slithers along, and the serpent says, You know, there was this one tree. I mean, God gave you everything. You know, you have all the things, but there was one tree in the middle of the garden that God said, don't eat. But Adam and Eve, I think you should eat it. I think you should just take a bite, right? We know this story. And the way that this story keeps getting told is that is the way that sin entered into our human condition, all right? And the book of Genesis actually is this set of spirals that go deeper and deeper into sin, because many of us will look at this and say, well, what's wrong with eating a bit of fruit? I mean, you just said, Pastor, that a donut's okay, and now you're saying I can't eat this fruit. This story of the book of Genesis spirals pretty quickly into the ways that sin really distorts and disrupts our understanding of God's world and our role in it. So the next story that comes out of this story of Adam and Eve is of Cain and Abel. And of course, I have this really cute sheep here. So Abel was a shepherd. That was what Abel was best known as. Abel would go out and tend the sheep, and the scriptures say that God preferred Abel's offering of sheep. God didn't prefer his brother's offering of grain. And if you prefer one over the other, then kids will fight. But in this story in Genesis, Cain kills Abel. Cain kills Abel, hides it, runs away, lies to God, twists the truth, and eventually wanders off into a life apart from community, apart from the calling of God. Spirals of sin, eating a fruit, killing your brother, a whole new level. Next, there's another story of a man who kills an entire village. It's really brutal. Spirals of sin. And it finally leads into this story of the Tower of Babel, where the people are gathered building bricks. And it says for some reason in the scriptures that they were building bricks instead of hewing stone. And they built these bricks and wanted to build a tower to make a name for themselves. But I wonder if even further, this Tower of Babel was about this really slippery question that the serpent suggested to Eve and to Adam. You see, when the serpent recommended eating that fruit, the serpent said, "You will be like God." And so when the people are building this Tower of Babel all the way up to the heavens, in the ancient world, they believed that God lived above the dome of the sky, that's where God's throne room was. And so the people building this Tower of Babel actually wanted to climb this tower and look God in the eyeballs. You see, the temptation of the serpent isn't about fruit or donuts. It isn't about pleasure or being an ascetic and giving up the things of this world. It's actually about believing that we can take God's place. You see, sin, like I said, is an action, it's a condition, and it's a web. An action is easy, right? We sin. We actively hurt one another. I think that if we were to say, I never hurt anybody in my life. Yeah, well, you're lying right now, so that's probably one way, right? I mean, we hurt one another. It happens. Even in the moments when we think we're going to be helping someone, sometimes we end up hurting them, right? Often in our households, we know that with the people we love the most. When I'm doing premarital counseling, I often just invite people to name the ways that they push each other's buttons, first in a joking way, right? You know, I mean, do you always put your keys on the spot where you're not supposed to put your keys, right? Or do you always do the dishes in a weird way? You know, whatever it is, the ways that we push each other's buttons jokingly, it's easy for couples to get into that. But then deeper, I invite couples to acknowledge the ways that we can hurt our partners in ways that no one else can hurt them. We have such an intimate space with the people that we love. We know them the best, that we know exactly the thing to say that will hurt the most. And sometimes in the heat of a moment, it slips out. And don't you wish that moment you could just grab it, tuck it back into the wallet, throw it away, but we don't. We hurt one another. So sin is an action. It's also a condition. I have blue eyes. My daughter, Dorothy, begs to differ. She says, "No, Daddy, they're gray." So bluish, grayish eyes. That's not going to change, likely. That's just who I am. You see, sin is a condition that we are in. We sin. We are full of sin at times. We are full of this brokenness, this inability to connect with one another, this way that we kind of get consumed in on ourselves. In the Reformation, Martin Luther had a great Latin word for it, because Martin Luther just always had a good Latin word for something. I don't really know why. He always wanted people to speak in German, but anyway. The Latin word is incurvatus in se. We're curved in. Incurvatus sounds like curve. We're curved in on ourselves. This condition of being just kind of obsessed with our own reflection, right? And I think all of us are. You know, I'm much more interested in my own story than I am with hearing someone else's. We're all kind of curved in on ourselves. But third, and this is the one that's been the most helpful to me, is that sin is also a web. It's an interconnectedness of things that somehow just doesn't do things the right way. Do you know what I'm talking about? Right? The world in which we live is sinful, right? And when we say that, we're not saying that the beautiful rain that we had last night is sin, that there are sins dropping off of my roof and falling into the ground. No, we're saying that in this interconnectedness of human beings who are in the condition of being sinful, who often do actions that are sins against one another, that this creates this interconnected web, these systems and structures of sin that actually compound on one another, that make it harder generation after generation after generation for some people to get access and other people to have much more, right? We've been talking about this in and out. Sin is an action, a condition, and a web. And I think at the center of this question of sin is this question of, will we want to be like God? In these systems and structures, often we think that there's a more efficient way of doing things or a better way of doing things, and often that means my way, right? This web of sin, this condition of sin, this action of sin. And at the core of it is this question: do we want to be gods or do we want to be gods? You see what I did there? It's an English major joke. But truly, the temptation at the Garden of Eden is to be like God, is to ourselves become gods of our own kingdom, to make in our own image an idol of what we might be able to build or accomplish or do, rather than settling into what God has to say about us as God's children, as God's creation. All right? Pastor Lilliard last week, if you missed the sermon, you'll need to go back to it. All right? It was fabulous. Pastor Lilliard in his sermon last week shared a quote from Margaret Thatcher, "One more sinner among us," right? And Margaret Thatcher said, if my critics saw me walking over the Thames, they would say it was because I couldn't swim, right? The question of sin is a question of which critics we listen to, okay? And here's how. Exhibit number 1. This is a loaf of bread. I was texted this loaf of bread from a bunch of you fine sinners at the state fair because I decided it would be a fine idea to enter my sourdough bread into the Minnesota State Fair. And what did I receive? Nothing. No ribbon. My bread's in the case. 14 days later, that bread looks a little iffy, I tell you. But I received no awards, no accolades. They said in an email, they said, you'll get your scorecard in the mail. So I thought, oh, fun. I'll get my scorecard, and then I'll be able to improve it and submit next year. Except the thing came in the mail, and all it was my submission letter and a little note that said, we included the scorecards for the top 20% of submissions. That tells you where I lay on the great state of Minnesota. Nowhere near the top of Baker's. Nowhere near. But I'll tell you, did it matter to me? Not one iota. Well, I mean, maybe one iota. All right, fine. I am a sinner. I am human. But I was telling this story to a friend, and I was just so excited to see my bread in this case, to bring it to the state fair, to see all of these other bakers, that I didn't care whether I got a blue ribbon or a red ribbon or no ribbon at all. And this friend of mine said, it's important to listen to the right critics, right? Because who cares if the state fair thinks my bread is best? I get to give it to my daughter and she puts butter on it and smiles. I get to deliver it to people and put it on their doorstep and they say, "Whew, that's good," right? It's important to listen to the right critics. When we're talking about sin, we're talking about listening to the right critic. And who's that critic? This is that Sunday school question. Do you think you can answer right? Who is it? It's Jesus, it's God. Yeah, this is the really easy one, right? But it's not so easy. We often get wrapped up into listening to the voices of so many others when listening for God's voice, for God's critique, is what it means to be looking at sin. Do we want to be God's, or do we want to belong to God, right? On the sinner side, we want to be like God. We want to assert ourselves, our power, our influence, our ideas, our vision, our bread. But on the saint side, we are God's beloved. We are God's creatures. We are made a little bit lower than the angels in the very image of God. And so I want to introduce you to an entirely different story. We know the story of Adam and Eve. We know the wily serpent, right? But just a few verses before this comes a poem about the creation of the universe itself. You see, a few verses before the Garden of Eden, the story begins when God started creating the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless, it was void, and there was delightful darkness covering the face of these swirling, chaotic waters. And a wind, a breath, a spirit from God swept out over the waters and said in a breath, "Let there be light." And do you know what? There was. And God continues to create. You know this story. God doesn't settle just with light and darkness. God scatters the stars in the sky. God hews the sun and the moon. God sends the winds across creation. God lifts up seeds and plants. God scatters fish and bugs. God crafts animals and mammals and birds and reptiles. God creates human beings in the very image of God. And after God creates every single thing that it exists, God has one word to say about them. Do you know what it is? I heard it. Good. God doesn't say perfect. God doesn't say excellent. God doesn't say proficient. God doesn't say outstanding. God doesn't say meets expectations or exceeds expectations. God doesn't say satisfactory. God doesn't give it a B plus or an A minus. God says good. God creates sun and moon, good. God creates rivers and streams, good. God creates the seasons and the stars, good. God creates animals and plants, good. And God creates you and me and says that we are good. Two stories in the very first few pages of the Bible saints and sinners. You see, friends, we are sinners. It's the truth. But we are also saints. In the very same moment, in the very same breath, we have great capacity to do amazing things in the world. And we also have great capacity to hurt those people around us and all of the people that we're connected into across this web of creation. We can hurt one another. We are sinners and we are saints in the same moment and in the same breath. But we are God's beloved. It's the truth about us. If we sat down with God and said, God, let's be real, that's what God would have to say. I love you. There's nothing you can do that will make me love you less. And we are created in the image of God with the same love that lit the stars. I inherited some of that world in sinners of the hands of an angry God. So one of the things I want to pass on to my kids is a different sort of imagination. So every night before bed, my 2-year-old, who in the blink of an eye is 9, I ask her, who created you, Alma? And she says, God created me. And then I ask her a second question, how did God create you? And she answers, God created me good. So the question for us today, what good will you do?